Khaled Elgindy, who's a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where he also directs their program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. Welcome to the program. Khaled, I've been following your tweets very closely. You've been very active. You've been watching Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech closely in Congress. Just your reaction to what he said yesterday.
Well, I think initially there had been some hopes that he would try to project a kind of more conciliatory tone, to not kind of wade into the partisanship in Washington, and to maybe even strike a moderate tone in terms of a ceasefire deal. But I think all of those expectations were frustrated actually by the speech, which was defiant, it was fiery, it was highly rhetorical. He painted the world into very clear black and white terms. I think this is the sort of imagery that resonates with a certain segment of American as well as Israeli politics, but by no means all of American politics. And I think he ended up in a lot of ways alienating a good chunk of his American audience, particularly in the attack on American students who are protesting against what many believe is a genocide in Gaza. He called them Iran's useful idiots, and that they were disgraceful and should be ashamed of themselves. I doubt that very many American parents of those students would welcome those kinds of descriptions.
Indeed. And I want to ask you about the protests and the impact they're having in a minute. But just as we look at those images there of President Biden and Netanyahu, there's so many questions right now on what's going to come out of this that is solid, that is tangible, to possibly move towards a ceasefire deal. What pressure do you think Biden can apply to actually get a ceasefire deal in Gaza and return the hostages? We were just talking now with our correspondent, John Brain, who says that Biden, well, he's not on the campaign trail now. He would like to make this part of his legacy. Do you think that?
I do think Biden would like to get a ceasefire. I'm just not sure how far he's willing to go to get it. We've seen for many months now that the president has expressed a great deal of frustration with Netanyahu, even laying down so-called red lines that of course Netanyahu easily blew through. But we haven't really seen any willingness to expend major political capital on the issue of a ceasefire or the Palestinian situation in general. That could change, of course. The fact that he's a lame duck and that he doesn't have those political pressures to behave in a certain way kind of frees his hand in theory, but that assumes that he's actually inclined, that he feels that it's important enough to expend whatever political capital he may have left in trying to reach this deal. But I think he will not want to set any new precedents, for example, by conditioning aid or by putting real pressure on Israel. And I think the fact that Netanyahu himself made no mention of the ceasefire in his speech yesterday indicates that he has an entirely different set of priorities. I think he was here to garner support for continuing the war rather than agreeing to a ceasefire. And I think everyone understands that Netanyahu needs the war to continue for him to be able to stay in power.
Absolutely. Khaled, you're in Washington. I'm sure you've seen the protests. What impact are those protests having on public opinion and also on the campaign? And how would you say they've evolved over the past 9 to 10 months?
Yeah, it's hard to say exactly how the protests are affecting public opinion broadly. We know that many in the political establishment in Washington, both Republicans and Democrats, have been quite critical of the protest movement, particularly on college campuses. We saw in the spring many university presidents being brought to Washington to testify and put on the defensive as to why they're not doing more to crush or suppress these protests. So many people in the power centers, particularly in Washington, feel threatened by the protests. But I do think they signify, I think there's a deeper understanding that they are part of a current that cannot simply be quashed, but that represents a major shift, a generational shift in how Americans, especially young Americans, view the issue of Palestine and Israel, not through a traditionally Israeli lens, the way most of Washington does, but rather through a lens of humanity and human rights and equality and other kind of idealistic notions. But that hasn't made its way up yet to the power centers, although there is hope that a new generation of Democratic Party leaders will be more responsive to those demands. And I think a lot of that is now falling onto Kamala Harris as the presumptive nominee for president for the Democratic Party.
Absolutely. We'll have to see what happens if she does become the next US president. Khaled, thank you very much indeed for your time and your analysis. Really appreciate it. Khaled Elgindy, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, live from Washington. Thank you.